The rain had been relentless for 3 days in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. The air hung thick with moisture and the promise of cooler weather, but beneath the surface of this West African nation, political tensions simmered like a pot about to boil over. President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the window of his presidential office, watching the raindrops cascade down the bulletproof glass. At 35, he was one of Africa's youngest leaders, having come to power through a military coup that promised to restore dignity and sovereignty to his nation. His reflection showed a man bearing the weight of a country's hopes. Sharp cheekbones, intelligent eyes that had seen too much, and the bearing of someone who had never known the luxury of complete trust. The walls of his office told the story of his transformation from soldier to statesman. Military commendations hung beside photographs with other African leaders, while a map of Burkina Faso dominated one wall, marked with pins indicating mining sites, agricultural projects, and infrastructure developments. Each pin represented a battle fought against foreign interests that had bled his country dry for generations. Ibrahim's rise to power had been swift and decisive. 2 years earlier, as a colonel in the National Army, he had watched in growing frustration as Roch Marc Christian Kabore's government continued the same colonial-era policies that kept Burkina Faso's vast gold reserves flowing to European banks while his people remained among the world's poorest. The final straw had come when Kabore signed a new mining contract with a French consortium, giving away 70% of revenues from newly discovered lithium deposits. The coup had taken less than 6 hours. Ibrahim's forces had secured key government buildings while broadcasting messages of liberation rather than conquest. "We are not seizing power, we are returning it to the people of Burkina Faso." Now, as he prepared for another difficult meeting with foreign diplomats, Ibrahim reflected on how naive those early promises seemed. Power, he had learned, was something you didn't seize or return. It was something you fought to keep every single day. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. President, the French ambassador is here for your 3 p.m. meeting." Ibrahim straightened his uniform, noting how the fabric seemed to carry the weight of his responsibilities. These meetings with foreign diplomats had become increasingly tense since he'd begun challenging the old colonial arrangements. Ambassador Philippe Moreau was particularly persistent, a career diplomat who spoke perfect English but insisted on conducting all meetings in French, a small assertion of linguistic colonialism that Ibrahim found both irritating and telling. "Send him in, Yusuf." Yusuf Sonogo had been Ibrahim's aide-de-camp for 3 years, a trusted friend from their military academy days. A tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and intelligent eyes, Yusuf had the rare quality of speaking truth to power without losing respect for authority. If Ibrahim had learned anything from his meteoric rise to power, it was that in politics, trust was both your greatest asset and your most dangerous vulnerability. Ambassador Moreau entered with the calculated confidence of a man representing centuries of French influence and West Africa. He was impeccably dressed, his silver hair perfectly styled, carrying himself with the assumption that his presence alone should command respect. "President Traoré," Moreau began in French, settling into his chair without invitation, "I trust you've reconsidered our proposal regarding the lithium mining rights." Ibrahim responded in English, a small act of defiance that made Moreau's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Ambassador Moreau, I've told you repeatedly that Burkina Faso will no longer sign agreements that give foreign companies majority control of our natural resources." "You're being unrealistic," Moreau replied, switching to English with obvious reluctance. French companies have the technology, the capital, the international markets. Without our partnership, those resources remain worthless rocks in the ground. Worthless to whom? Ibrahim's voice carried a sharp edge. To the French companies that would extract billions in value while paying us pennies, or to the Burkina Bay people who would finally benefit from their own national wealth? The conversation continued for another hour, a careful dance of diplomatic language that barely concealed mutual hostility. Moreau left with polite smiles and veiled threats about consequences for nations that don't honor their international commitments. After the ambassador departed, Ibrahim turned to Yusuf. "What's your assessment?" Yusuf's expression was troubled. "They're not going to accept this gracefully, sir. French economic interests in the Sahel are worth tens of billions. They won't just walk away because we ask nicely." Ibrahim nodded grimly. He had expected this resistance, but he had also underestimated how personal the French would make their retaliation. That same afternoon, while Ibrahim navigated the treacherous waters of international diplomacy, his wife Fatima walked alone through the rain-soaked paths of Ouagadougou's oldest public garden. The Parc Urbain Bangre Wago had been her sanctuary since childhood, a place where she could escape the suffocating protocols of being the president's wife. At 28, Fatima possessed the kind of beauty that stopped conversations, but more than that, she had a sharp intellect that her husband's political advisors found both impressive and potentially dangerous. In a different time, a different place, she might have been the politician. Instead, she found herself relegated to ribbon-cutting ceremonies and charity galas, her Cambridge education in international relations gathering dust while she smiled for cameras. The transition from professor's wife to president's wife had been jarring. 3 years ago, she had been Dr. Fatima Ouedraogo, a respected academic at the University of Ouagadougou, publishing papers on post-colonial economic theory and lecturing to packed auditoriums. Students had competed to take her courses on decolonizing African economics, and her research on Chinese investment in Africa had been cited in policy papers across the continent. Marriage to Ibrahim had initially felt like a partnership of equals. They had met at a conference on African development, where her presentation on breaking the resource curse had caught the attention of the young colonel in the audience. Their courtship had been intellectual as much as romantic. Long conversations about African unity, development theory, and the need for new approaches to governance. But the coup had changed everything. Overnight, her husband became one of the most powerful men in West Africa, and she became an accessory to his power rather than a partner in wielding it. Her academic career ended abruptly. Security concerns, they said, though she suspected the real reason was that her feminist views and international profile made Ibrahim's advisors nervous. The garden felt different today. The usual joggers and families were absent, leaving the pathways eerily empty. Fatima pulled her headscarf tighter against the drizzle, but she couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were tracking her every movement. Her security detail was supposed to maintain discreet distance, but something felt wrong about the silence. Her instincts proved correct. 2 figures emerged from behind a cluster of mango trees, their faces obscured by hoods. They moved with the calculated precision of predators who had studied their prey. Fatima's academic mind immediately began analyzing the situation. Their positioning suggested professional training. Their approach indicated they wanted her alive rather than dead, and their timing suggested inside knowledge of her routine. "Mrs. Traoré," one called out in accented French, "please don't be afraid, we just want to talk." But Fatima was already afraid. The wife of a president learns to recognize danger in the tilt of a stranger's head, the position of their hands, the way they move their feet. These men meant harm, regardless of their reassuring words. She ran. Her designer heels slipped on the wet stones as she sprinted down the garden path, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she could hear the heavy footfalls of her pursuers gaining ground. The irony wasn't lost on her. All those security briefings, all those protocols, and here she was, alone and defenseless in a place that had once felt safe. The garden's winding paths, which she had known since childhood, became a maze of potential escape routes and dead ends. Fatima's mind raced through possibilities: the old caretaker's shed, the maintenance tunnels, the hidden path that led to the adjacent neighborhood. But her pursuers seemed to know the layout almost as well as she did. Just as one of the men reached for her hijab, a rock struck him square in the face. "Leave her alone!" A young woman, no more than 20, emerged from the underbrush with the fierce determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, with the kind of wiry strength that came from surviving on the streets. Her clothes were simple but clean, her eyes bright with intelligence, and something else, a calculating awareness that seemed at odds with her apparent youth and poverty. "This way," she shouted, grabbing Fatima's hand. "I know these paths better than they do." They ran together through a maze of overgrown trails, ducking under low branches and leaping over fallen logs. The girl moved like a gazelle, sure-footed despite the slippery terrain. When they finally stopped, both women were gasping for breath beside an old caretaker's hut that Fatima had forgotten existed. Who are you?" Fatima managed between breaths. The girl's name was Farrar, or so she said. Her story emerged in fragments as they caught their breath. Parents lost to illness during the COVID pandemic, surviving on odd jobs and charity, dreams of something better than life on Ouagadougou's streets. She spoke 3 languages fluently and had clearly received some education, though she claimed to never have attended university. "I come here sometimes," Farrar explained, gesturing to the garden. "It's peaceful, and the guards don't bother people who keep quiet. I was reading under that tree when I saw those men following you." What Fatima couldn't see was the small communication device hidden in Farrar's shoe, or the way the girl's eyes constantly cataloged every detail of their surroundings, or the practiced ease with which she had dispatched their attackers. The rock that had struck the first man hadn't been thrown in panic. It had been aimed with the precision of someone trained in combat tactics. Farrar O'Coffer was not her real name. She was Agent Nina Harper, 24 years old, Harvard-educated, and one of the CIA's most promising field operatives in West Africa. The attack on Fatima hadn't been a kidnapping attempt. It had been an elaborate piece of theater designed to establish Nina's cover as Fatima's savior. The 2 attackers were also CIA assets, recruited from Burkina Faso's unemployed youth and paid handsomely to play their roles. The staged rescue had taken weeks to choreograph, with Nina studying Fatima's routines, identifying the perfect location, and rehearsing every detail until it looked spontaneous. "You saved my life," Fatima said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "How can I repay you?" Nina looked down, manufacturing just the right amount of humble bashfulness. "I don't need payment, madame, but if you know of any work, I'm a good cook, and I can clean. I learned from the nuns at the orphanage before I had to leave." The fictional orphanage was a masterful touch. It explained Nina's education, while making her story tragic enough to evoke sympathy. Nina had spent months developing this backstory, creating false documents and planting corroborating evidence in case anyone investigated. That evening, against the advice of her security detail, Fatima brought Nina home to the presidential residence. The presidential residence in Ouagadougou was a compound that mixed colonial architecture with modern security features. High walls topped with razor wire, guard towers manned around the clock, and sophisticated electronic surveillance systems created multiple rings of protection around the first family. None of it could protect against the enemy that had just walked through the front door. Nina adapted to life in the presidential residence with remarkable ease. She was the perfect domestic worker, efficient, discreet, and seemingly devoted to Fatima's well-being. She brought morning tea with just the right amount of sugar, remembered Fatima's preferences without being asked, and listened with apparent sympathy as the president's wife shared her frustrations about her constrained role. But every detail of Nina's performance had been carefully calculated. Nina's training at the CIA's Harvey Point facility included extensive instruction in domestic skills, psychological manipulation, and what intelligence professionals called lifestyle intelligence, the art of gathering information through intimate observation of daily routines. Nina's room in the servants' quarters had been chosen specifically for its location near the main house's ventilation system, enabling her to monitor conversations throughout the residence. Her cleaning duties gave her access to offices, bedrooms, and private spaces that might leave sensitive documents unguarded. Most importantly, her role as Fatima's personal assistant provided intimate access to the president's wife during her most vulnerable moments. Late at night, when the household slept, Nina would retrieve an encrypted satellite communicator from its hiding place in her mattress and file her reports. The device, no larger than a smartphone, bounced signals off commercial satellites to avoid detection by Burkina Faso's limited electronic surveillance capabilities. Mockingbird to control, integration successful. Primary target has full confidence, beginning psychological profile development. Secondary target maintains consistent schedule. Request psychological manipulation parameters. The voice that responded carried the crisp authority of Langley. Proceed with Phase 2. Exploit marital tensions. Target is suspected of harboring political ambitions. Amplify existing resentment toward husband's career priorities. Nina was a specialist in what the intelligence community called human exploitation, the art of finding psychological pressure points and applying precisely calibrated pressure until the target broke in useful ways. Her training had included graduate-level psychology, method acting, and enough martial arts to handle situations that went sideways. Her psychological assessment of Fatima had identified key vulnerabilities: intellectual frustration, romantic neglect, and suppressed political ambitions. Nina's job was to nurture these frustrations until they overwhelmed Fatima's loyalty to her husband. Fatima Traoré, brilliant as she was, had no defense against someone who understood exactly which emotional buttons to push. The campaign began subtly. Nina would listen as Fatima complained about feeling invisible, then gently suggest that perhaps the president didn't fully appreciate his wife's capabilities. When Fatima mentioned her unused education, Nina would wonder aloud whether Ibrahim deliberately kept his wife in the background because he feared her intelligence. "You could run this country better than any of those men," Nina would say while braiding Fatima's hair. "It's a shame that in Africa, women are still expected to stand in the shadows." Nina had studied Fatima's academic work and could discuss post-colonial theory with surprising sophistication. She would ask thoughtful questions about Fatima's research, express admiration for her intellectual achievements, and subtly contrast the president's wife's obvious capabilities with her current marginalized role. At Cambridge, did you ever imagine you'd end up organizing charity luncheons instead of shaping economic policy? Nina asked one evening as they walked through the residence's garden. The question hit its mark. Fatima's expression darkened, as she considered how far she had fallen from her academic dreams. "I thought marriage would be a partnership. I thought we would build something together," she admitted. Week by week, conversation by conversation, Nina fed Fatima's resentment until it grew from occasional frustration into a consuming sense of injustice. The president's wife began to see slights where none existed, to interpret her husband's busy schedule as deliberate neglect, to dream of stepping out from behind his shadow. 3,000 miles away, in a nondescript office building in McLean, Virginia, Daniel Hassan reviewed Nina's latest psychological assessment of Fatima Traoré. Hassan was a 20-year veteran of intelligence work, a man who had orchestrated regime changes on 3 continents and never lost a night's sleep over the consequences. At 52, he possessed the lean build and sharp features of someone who had spent decades in field operations before transitioning to management. His office walls displayed no awards or commendations, just a world map marked with colored pins indicating active operations and a shelf of academic books on African politics that most of his colleagues assumed were for show. The Burkina Faso operation was personal for him. 2 years earlier, President Traoré had expelled French mining companies and canceled contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Worse, he had begun forming alliances with Russia and China, threatening Western influence throughout the Sahel region. Hassan had watched similar developments in Mali, Niger, and Chad with growing alarm. The domino effect, he had warned his superiors at CIA headquarters. If Traoré succeeds in breaking free from Western economic control, every other African leader will try to follow his example, will lose the entire continent. Hassan's assignment was simple: remove Traoré from power by any means necessary. The original plan had been straightforward assassination, but Hassan preferred more elegant solutions. A dead president became a martyr. A disgraced president who lost power due to his own wife's betrayal became a cautionary tale that would discourage other African leaders from challenging the established order. The operation had taken months to plan. Hassan's team had studied Traoré's inner circle, identifying potential pressure points and recruitment targets. Fatima had emerged as the perfect candidate, intellectually enough to be useful, frustrated enough to be manipulated, and positioned to inflict maximum damage on her husband's presidency. "Controlled to Mockingbird," Hassan spoke into his encrypted phone. "Phase 3 is approved. Introduce the substance. Target should be incapacitated for 72 hours minimum. That window will be sufficient for our local assets to arrange a medical emergency and transfer of power." The substance was a sophisticated pharmaceutical compound developed by CIA scientists at a black site facility in Eastern Europe. Undetectable by standard medical tests, it would induce symptoms resembling a stroke or heart attack while keeping the victim alive but unconscious. By the time Traoré recovered, his VP, already compromised through a separate intelligence operation, would have transferred power to a military council friendly to Western interests. On the other end of the line, Nina Harper acknowledged the order while simultaneously calculating the risks. She had poisoned targets before, but never in such a high-security environment, and never someone she had begun to genuinely like. Professional sympathy for targets was an occupational hazard that Nina had learned to suppress during her training. Ibrahim Traoré might be a decent man, but he had made the mistake of challenging American interests. In the grand chess game of geopolitics, individual lives were simply pieces to be sacrificed for larger strategic gains. The crown jewel of this network was Yusuf Sanogo, Ibrahim's trusted aide-de-camp. Hassan's agents had spent months studying Yusuf's background before identifying his vulnerability. A daughter studying medicine in Paris whose visa status could be easily manipulated, and a wife whose small business depended on government contracts that could disappear with a single phone call. Nina's opportunity came during the holy month of Ramadan. Each evening after breaking his fast, President Traoré would drink a traditional almond-based beverage that Fatima prepared personally. It was one of the few domestic rituals that the couple still shared, a moment of intimacy in their increasingly strained marriage. The almond drink held deep personal significance for Ibrahim. His grandmother had prepared the same beverage during his childhood, teaching him that the bitter almonds represented life's hardships, while the honey and dates represented hope for sweetness to come. It was more than refreshment. It was a spiritual practice that connected him to his heritage and his faith. The almond drink, Nina mentioned casually while helping Fatima in the kitchen. It's such a beautiful tradition. My grandmother used to make something similar. She produced a small vial of clear liquid from her apron pocket. The container was elegant, made of crystal with an ornate silver cap that suggested luxury rather than poison. This is pure essence of jasmine. Just a few drops would make the drink even more special, a surprise for the president. Fatima examined the vial, admiring its craftsmanship. The liquid inside appeared harmless, even elegant, catching the kitchen light like liquid crystal. It won't change the taste too much? Just a subtle floral note, Nina assured her, like drinking liquid moonlight. In my grandmother's village, they believed jasmine essence brought peace to troubled marriages. The comment was carefully calculated. Nina had spent weeks building up Fatima's resentment about her marriage, and now she was offering a solution that seemed both romantic and practical. What better way to surprise a distant husband than with a special addition to their shared ritual? What Fatima didn't know was that the jasmine essence was actually a sophisticated pharmaceutical compound designed to induce deep coma-like sleep for 48 to 72 hours. The victim would appear to have suffered a stroke or heart attack, and by the time they recovered, their government would have collapsed and new leadership would be in place. As Fatima stood in the kitchen holding the vial, her conscience waged war with her ambition. Nina's psychological manipulation had been skillful but not complete. Despite weeks of carefully planted seeds of resentment, Fatima's fundamental love for her husband remained intact beneath the surface frustrations. She had begun to fantasize about stepping out of Ibrahim's shadow, about showing the world what she was capable of. Nina had painted vivid pictures of Fatima as a political leader in her own right, perhaps eventually president herself. But poisoning her husband, even temporarily, crossed a line she wasn't sure she could uncross. The call to evening prayers echoed across Ouagadougou, and something in that ancient sound made Fatima hesitate. She looked at the vial in her hand, then at the glass of almond milk, then at her reflection in the kitchen window. The woman staring back at her looked like a stranger, someone capable of betrayal, someone who had lost her way in the maze of her own ambitions. Was this who she had become? Someone who would betray the person she had once loved completely? Fatima threw the vial against the kitchen wall, where it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The compound splashed across the floor, where the household cat immediately began to investigate. Within seconds, the animal was convulsing, its body racked with seizures, before going completely still. Oh God, what was I about to do? President Ibrahim Traoré had not survived 3 years in power by being naive about human nature. From the moment Nina Harper had arrived in his household, he had maintained discreet surveillance on the young woman who had so conveniently appeared to save his wife. His intelligence chief, Captain Basit Konate, was a methodical man who trusted coincidences as much as he trusted foreign diplomats bearing gifts. A former student at France's École Militaire who had become disillusioned with French influence in African military affairs, had built Burkina Faso's intelligence services from scratch using a combination of Soviet-era techniques and modern technology. "Mr. President," Konate had reported 3 days after Nina's arrival, "I've completed the initial background check on the young woman your wife brought home. There are irregularities." Konate's investigation had revealed disturbing inconsistencies in Nina's story. The orphanage she claimed to have attended had no record of anyone matching her description. Her supposed employment history couldn't be verified through any of the usual channels. Most tellingly, electronic surveillance had detected encrypted communications originating from the residential compound every night around 2 a.m. The signal strength and frequency patterns are consistent with military-grade satellite communications. This isn't someone calling family members, this is professional intelligence work, Konate explained. But Ibrahim had made a calculated decision to allow the operation to continue because he wanted to identify not just the agent, but her entire network. Catching Nina Harper was less important than understanding who sent her and what they ultimately hoped to achieve. "Let her play her game," Ibrahim had instructed. "But I want to know everyone she contacts, every method she uses, every weakness in our security that she exploits. When we move against her, I want to roll up the entire network." The surveillance operation had been sophisticated and invisible. Konate's team had planted microscopic listening devices throughout the servants' quarters, monitored all electronic communications, and even analyzed Nina's behavioral patterns using facial recognition technology that could detect stress indicators and deception markers. What they discovered painted a picture of a sophisticated psychological operation targeting not just Ibrahim, but the entire structure of his government. Nina's nightly reports revealed attempts to recruit other domestic staff, efforts to map the compound's security systems, and a systematic campaign to manipulate Fatima's emotional state. The broken vial in the kitchen was the final piece of evidence they needed. "She tried to poison me," Ibrahim said quietly as he reviewed the laboratory analysis of the spilled compound. The substance was unlike anything in Burkina Faso's medical databases, clearly the product of advanced pharmaceutical research. "This isn't just espionage anymore. This is attempted assassination." Captain Konate nodded grimly. "The compound is designed to simulate natural causes while keeping the victim alive but unconscious. By the time you recovered, they would have had time to implement whatever political changes they had planned. Do we move against her tonight? Not yet. Let her think she has succeeded in corrupting Fatima. I want to see who she contacts when she believes the operation has moved to the next phase." That night, Nina Harper sent what she believed would be her final report from Burkina Faso. "Mockingbird to control. Primary target has administered substance. Estimate 6 to 8 hours until symptoms manifest. Prepare for Phase 4 implementation." But instead of preparing for Ibrahim's incapacitation, intelligence officers were preparing to spring the trap that would expose an international conspiracy reaching from the corridors of CIA headquarters to the mining boardrooms of Paris and London. Konate's team had spent weeks preparing for this moment. They had identified all of Nina's contacts within the government, tracked her communication methods, and even penetrated the encrypted network she used to communicate with her handlers. When they moved, it would be a coordinated operation designed to capture not just Nina, but everyone connected to the conspiracy. The arrest came at 3 a.m., swift and professionally executed. Nina Harper awoke to find herself surrounded by armed soldiers, her communication equipment already bagged as evidence, her careful cover blown apart by months of patient counterintelligence work. She had been trained for this possibility, but the reality was more disorienting than any simulation. One moment she had been sleeping peacefully, confident that her operation was nearing successful completion. The next, she was on her knees with automatic weapons pointed at her head while her room was systematically searched. "Agent Harper," President Traoré said as he entered the detention room 6 hours later. "Or do you prefer Nina? Or perhaps we should use your real name, Lieutenant Sarah Coleman, U.S. Army Special Forces, seconded to CIA Operations Division." Nina's training had prepared her for capture, but not for the particular humiliation of being outsmarted by someone she had been taught to consider intellectually inferior. African presidents in her worldview were supposed to be corrupt strongmen, not sophisticated strategists capable of running complex counterintelligence operations. The interrogation room was stark but professional, clearly designed by people who understood international law and wanted to avoid accusations of mistreating prisoners. A video camera recorded everything, legal observers took notes, and medical personnel monitored her condition. This wasn't the crude torture facility she had expected to find in West Africa. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said, falling back on standard intimidation tactics. "The United States government will not tolerate the mistreatment of American citizens." Ibrahim smiled coldly. "The same American government that sent you here to assassinate a democratically elected African leader? I think they'll be quite eager to disavow any knowledge of your activities." Over the next 48 hours, as Nina's handler, Daniel Hassan, desperately tried to activate extraction protocols, the full scope of the operation became clear. Wiretaps revealed communications between CIA assets and French intelligence services. Financial records showed payments to local collaborators totaling nearly $2 million. Most damaging of all, encrypted communications revealed the broader strategy of destabilizing governments throughout the Sahel region. The betrayal by Yusuf Sanogo hit Ibrahim harder than the assassination attempt itself. They had served together in the military, had shared the dangers and dreams of young officers who believed they could make their country better. The discovery that his closest advisor had been feeding intelligence to foreign powers for over a year felt like losing a brother. "Why?" Ibrahim asked during Yusuf's interrogation. His voice carried more sadness than anger. Yusuf couldn't meet his eyes. "They threatened my family, my daughter. They showed me pictures of her leaving her dormitory in Paris. They knew her class schedule, her friends, everything. They said she would have an accident if I didn't cooperate." The revelation that foreign intelligence services had been targeting the families of government officials added another dimension to the conspiracy. This wasn't just about removing Ibrahim from power, it was about terrorizing anyone who might resist Western economic interests. The international media called it the trial of the century, the first time an African nation had successfully prosecuted American intelligence officers for attempted regime change. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and dozens of other networks set up satellite trucks outside the courthouse in Ouagadougou as the world watched a small West African nation challenge the global superpower. The courthouse itself became a symbol of African sovereignty. Built in the traditional Sudano-Sahelian architectural style, but equipped with modern technology, it represented the fusion of African heritage and contemporary governance that Ibrahim's administration was trying to achieve throughout the country. Ibrahim's testimony included devastating details about French and American economic policies in the region. He presented contracts showing how Western companies had extracted billions of dollars in resources while paying minimal royalties to African governments. He documented cases where development aid had been tied to political conditions that prevented economic independence. The trial lasted 3 months and generated thousands of hours of international news coverage. Legal experts debated whether Burkina Faso's courts had jurisdiction over CIA operatives. Human rights organizations demanded that the defendants receive fair treatment despite their crimes. African leaders watched nervously, wondering whether they too might face similar operations if they challenged Western interests too aggressively. The defense arguments were predictable, but legally sophisticated. Nina's lawyers, provided by the American government despite official denials of her CIA status, argued that she had been conducting legitimate intelligence gathering rather than assassination attempts. Hassan's defense team claimed he was a private contractor with no official government authority. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented intercepts of communications between Hassan and CIA headquarters. They showed financial transfers from accounts linked to American intelligence agencies. Most damaging of all, they played recordings of Hassan discussing the operation with his superiors in Virginia. When the verdict came, it reverberated around the world. Nina Harper, guilty of espionage, attempted assassination, and conspiracy against the state. Sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Hassan al-Mansour, guilty of orchestrating crimes against Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Yusuf Sanogo, guilty of treason, but given a suspended sentence in recognition of his cooperation with authorities and the coercion he had faced. The sentences sent shockwaves through Western intelligence agencies. For the first time in decades, American operatives would serve serious prison time for actions taken against an African government. The message was clear: the days of consequence-free intervention in African affairs might finally be ending. In the aftermath of the trial, President Ibrahim Traoré found himself dealing with a different kind of challenge: rebuilding trust with his wife. Fatima's near betrayal had shattered something fundamental in their relationship, even though she had ultimately chosen loyalty over ambition. The weeks following Nina's arrest had been the most difficult of their marriage. Fatima was consumed by guilt over how close she had come to poisoning her husband, while Ibrahim struggled with the knowledge that his wife had been systematically turned against him by a foreign intelligence operation. "I need you to understand something," Ibrahim said as they walked together through the presidential garden one evening. "I never tried to keep you in the shadows because I didn't respect your abilities. I tried to protect you from the kind of pressure that breaks people." Fatima nodded, tears in her eyes. "I know that now, but I also need you to understand that protection can become another kind of prison. I don't want to be protected from life, I want to be part of it." Their conversations during this period were painful but necessary. Ibrahim shared details about the constant threats he faced, the assassination attempts that his security team had quietly thwarted, the psychological warfare that foreign intelligence agencies waged against African leaders and their families. Fatima, in turn, explained the intellectual suffocation she had felt, the way her identity had been slowly erased in favor of a sanitized public persona. "Nina didn't create my resentment," Fatima admitted during one particularly difficult conversation. She just exploited what was already there. That's what scares me most, how easily I was manipulated because I was already angry. Their marriage would never be quite the same, but it would be stronger in different ways. Fatima began taking on more substantial responsibilities in government, focusing on education and women's rights initiatives. Ibrahim created a new position for her, special advisor on social development, that allowed her to use her academic background while maintaining appropriate security protocols. The experience had changed them both. Ibrahim's speeches to other African leaders now carried a new urgency about the need for continental unity against external manipulation. He established the Ouagadougou Institute for African Security Studies, bringing together intelligence professionals from across the continent to share information about foreign interference operations. Fatima became a powerful advocate for African women's political participation, her story inspiring a new generation of female leaders. She wrote a book about her experience, The Shadow's Web: How Foreign Powers Target African First Families, that became required reading for government officials across the continent. The Nina Harper affair had consequences far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. African leaders who had previously competed with each other for Western favor began to understand that they faced a common threat. If intelligence agencies could successfully target a popular leader like Ibrahim Traoré, no African president was safe. The President William Ruto of Kenya was the first to reach out, offering to share intelligence about suspected Western operatives in his own government. "What happened to you could happen to any of us," he told Ibrahim during a secure video call. "We need to protect each other." Similar offers came from Ghana, Senegal, Rwanda, and even traditionally pro-Western nations like Botswana and Namibia. The African Union established a new committee on foreign interference, with Ibrahim serving as its first chairman. The committee's initial report, compiled over 6 months of investigation, revealed the scope of Western intelligence operations across the continent. Every African nation had been targeted to some degree, with operations ranging from simple surveillance to elaborate regime change plots. The report documented, "The Western response to Ibrahim's success was swift and multifaceted. While they could no longer use crude assassination attempts, they had other weapons in their arsenal." Economic sanctions came first. The United States froze Burkina Faso's assets in American banks and prohibited American companies from doing business with the government. The European Union followed suit, cutting off development aid and imposing travel bans on government officials. "They're trying to strangle us economically," Ibrahim's finance minister reported during a cabinet meeting. "Our foreign reserves are down 40%, and we're struggling to finance essential imports." But Ibrahim had anticipated this response. Even before the Nina Harper trial, he had begun diversifying Burkina Faso's economic partnerships. New agreements with China provided alternative financing for infrastructure projects. Russian companies stepped in to replace expelled French mining operations. Turkey offered military cooperation and technical assistance. The most significant partnership was with Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso's southern neighbors. The three countries established a customs union that reduced their dependence on European markets and created new trade routes that bypassed Western-controlled ports. "We're not anti-Western," Ibrahim explained during a televised address to the nation. "We're pro-African. We want partnerships based on mutual respect, not colonial exploitation." The propaganda war was equally intense. Western media portrayed Ibrahim as an unstable dictator who is leading his country toward economic collapse. Think tanks published reports questioning his mental health and predicting popular uprising against his authoritarian rule. But these narratives struggled against the reality of Burkina Faso's economic indicators. GDP growth averaged 7% annually during Ibrahim's presidency. Literacy rates improved dramatically thanks to new school construction programs. Healthcare access expanded as the government used mining revenues to build hospitals and train medical professionals. In her cell in Ouagadougou Central Prison, Nina Harper experienced a different kind of education than anything the CIA had provided. The prison housed political prisoners from previous regimes, common criminals, and a surprising number of educated individuals who had run afoul of various governments over the years. Her cellmate was Dr. Aminata Sawadogo, a former university professor who had been imprisoned by a previous government for organizing pro-democracy protests. Dr. Sawadogo had served 8 years before Ibrahim's government released all political prisoners as part of its democratic reforms. "You're surprised to find me here," Dr. Sawadogo observed during Nina's first week. "You expected to find only illiterate criminals in an African prison." Nina's worldview, shaped by CIA training and American cultural assumptions, had indeed prepared her for a very different experience. The prison was overcrowded and underfunded, but it was also a place of intellectual ferment where prisoners organized educational programs, political debates, and even small businesses. "I was taught that African governments were inherently corrupt and incompetent," Nina admitted after several months. "But this prison is run more humanely than many American facilities I've seen." Dr. Sawadogo laughed bitterly. "That's because President Traoré actually believes in rehabilitation rather than punishment. It's one of the things that made him dangerous to your employers. He's proving that African leaders can govern competently." Through conversations with Dr. Sawadogo and other prisoners, Nina began to understand the historical context of Western involvement in Africa. She learned about the Franc-Afrique system that had kept former French colonies economically dependent. She studied the ways American companies had extracted resources while providing minimal compensation to local communities. Most painfully, she began to comprehend the human cost of operations like hers. Other prisoners shared stories of family members killed during Western-backed coups, communities displaced by mining operations, and young people who had fled to Europe because their own country's resources were being stolen. "I was fighting for freedom," Nina protested during one particularly difficult conversation. "Whose freedom?" Dr. Sawadogo asked. "The freedom of American companies to steal our gold? The freedom of French corporations to pay us pennies for our uranium? You weren't fighting for freedom. You were fighting to maintain slavery." 5 years after the trial, Nina Harper sat in the prison's library teaching English to fellow inmates while working on her own education in African history and economics. The CIA had officially disavowed her, and her government pension had been revoked. She would likely spend the rest of her life in West Africa, a continent she had once viewed as a playground for Western interests. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to Burkina Faso to destroy an African leader's marriage and government. Instead, she had become part of a community that was teaching her about the continent's true potential. Daniel Hassan had been less fortunate. He died in prison after 18 months, officially of a heart attack, though rumors persisted that he had been poisoned by other intelligence operatives who feared what secrets he might eventually reveal. His death served as a reminder that even Western intelligence agencies weren't above eliminating their own operatives when they became liabilities. President Ibrahim Traoré went on to serve 2 full terms, transforming Burkina Faso into one of Africa's most prosperous and politically stable nations. His success inspired similar movements across the continent as younger African leaders began challenging the economic and political arrangements that had kept their countries dependent on former colonial powers. The Ouagadougou model, as it came to be known, emphasized economic sovereignty, regional integration, and resistance to foreign interference. By 2030, 12 African nations had followed similar policies, creating a bloc of truly independent states that began to reshape the continent's relationship with the rest of the world. Fatima Traoré became one of Africa's most influential voices on women's rights and political participation. Her book about the intelligence operation against her family was translated into 15 languages and became a case study in universities around the world. She eventually served as Burkina Faso's foreign minister, using her Cambridge education and personal experience to build new partnerships with non-Western nations. The marriage between Ibrahim and Fatima, tested by foreign manipulation, emerged stronger than before. They had 3 children during Ibrahim's presidency, and their family became a symbol of African resilience against external threats. The Nina Harper affair, as historians would later call it, marked a turning point in African politics, the moment when the continent began to truly claim its independence, not just from formal colonialism, but from the subtler forms of control that had replaced it. In her final diary entry before her capture, Nina Harper had written, "These people have no idea how the real world works." She had been wrong. They understood exactly how the world worked, and they had decided to change it. The web of shadows that had once enveloped Burkina Faso had been torn apart, thread by thread, by people who refused to accept that their destiny should be decided in foreign capitals. In its place, they were weaving something new, a future where African nations would chart their own course, regardless of what Washington, Paris, or London might prefer. The rain had stopped falling on Ouagadougou, and the sun was finally beginning to shine. Author's note: this expanded story is a work of fiction inspired by real events and geopolitical dynamics in West Africa. While the characters and specific events are fictional, they reflect the ongoing struggle for true sovereignty that many African nations face in dealing with former colonial powers and global superpowers. The story explores themes of loyalty, betrayal, political awakening, and the complex realities of modern African leadership in a world where economic and intelligence warfare have often replaced direct military intervention. The expansion includes deeper character development, more detailed exploration of intelligence operations, and broader examination of continental African responses to foreign interference.